Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to Calvary Episcopal Church in the Great Hall. Those of you who are here with us and those of you who are joining us online, it's good to gather in all of the ways that we might. This morning we're going to have a great conversation in our continuing series called Practice What You Preach, connecting the dots between the conversations we're having at Lenten Preaching Series, with our Sunday mornings, and more importantly, with our lives. Later on this week, we're going to be welcoming Dr. Ellen Davis to our pulpit, and she is a scholar of Hebrew Scripture. She's also a scholar of sustainability and all things environmental and green, and making the connection between stewardship and the Bible, and again, our lives. And Heidi Rupke has brought together a wonderful group of folks to have a conversation about sustainable practices in our homes, in our workplaces, and in our churches. And I'm not going to take any time away from them so that you can hear from the wisdom of this wonderful group. So here she is.
Thank you, Catherine. As she said, I'm Heidi Rupke, and I coordinate the Lenten Preaching Series. I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Ellen Davis this week, Wednesday at noon and at 6:15 for a podcast conversation. And to get us ready for that, I called together a few friends of Calvary to talk about how we live sustainability and how we live faith. So I'm just going to start off with a quick question. Who are you, and what is your connection to Calvary?
Good morning. My name is Martha Lyle Ford. I'm a native and resident of Brownsville, Tennessee. I'm also director of the Center for Faith and Imagination at Memphis Theological Seminary, and I'm a doctoral candidate, almost finished, in land, food, and faith formation at MTS. My connection to Calvary is that over the last couple of decades, I have attended the Lenten Preaching Series, and this week, Memphis Seminary is collaborating with Calvary to bring Dr. Davis to Memphis. She will be here at Calvary on Wednesday and giving a lecture at MTS on Thursday.
I'm Susanne Darnell, and I have been a member here at Calvary for more than 30 years. And I'm a native Memphian, one of those folks. And I'm retired now, but I had two careers, one short, one long. The first one was when I was in my 20s, and it involved about over a period of 7.5 years serving with my husband in the Andes of Ecuador in an ecumenical mission. And then my second was at the University of Memphis, where I was for 31 years. First as faculty in the Department of Sociology, and then most of that time as an associate dean and interim dean in University College, now known as the College of Liberal and Professional Studies. And I'm not an expert on climate change. I look to my friend Jim Dorman for that expertise. He's here, and he's a geophysicist and seismologist, and has really helped me to appreciate our planet Earth.
I'm John Welcher. I'm an architect here in Memphis at Archimania. My connection to Calvary is that my family and I have been going here for about 4 years now, and it's been a real joy. I'm honored to be on this panel with these guys. I'm super excited to see what we talk about.
All right, thank you. So, some of you know I'm a big fan of Krista Tippett's program On Being, and she always starts with a question: what is the spiritual background of your childhood? I'm going to twist that question a little bit, and I'm going to ask you, since our topic today is about the environment and faith, I'm going to ask you to describe the landscape and food of your childhood. Could you describe the landscape and food of your childhood?
Okay, if we're going to go down the row, I'll start off. As I mentioned, I'm a native of Brownsville, Tennessee, which is a small county seat town about an hour from Memphis, county seat of Haywood County. It's a rural county. I grew up about, a couple miles outside of town, surrounded by agricultural fields. Most of my family members are in row crop agriculture. I grew up with what is now referred to as an outdoors childhood. meaning that when my mother was frustrated with us, she would say, go outside and play, and don't come back in until, it's dark. Lots of time romping and stomping, riding horses. Very, very privileged to be able to associate the outdoors with fun and recreation and not labor. I consider myself an outdoors person from childhood. I really don't have any memories in which the outdoors wasn't part of pretty much my everyday life.
Growing up in Memphis, like many others in my generation, I was just one generation away from the farm. Others might have been 2 generations, but that was typical of a lot, I think, people here in my generation. And both sets of my grandparents were involved in farming, in directly farming or in other ways. And that was just a typical thing. My, my aunt lived at Bailey Station between Germantown and Collierville. And that was out in the country. When we drove to her house, that was an expedition. And I spent much time there with my cousins and swinging on grapevines and picking blackberries and getting all scratched up and getting chiggers and other things. She often brought vegetables and all grown in her garden to our house. And fresh fruit and fresh vegetables were really important and considered very special in our diet. And my mother and 2 of her sisters were really into canning vegetables and making jams and jellies when I was a child. So I think that, and I think when I think of a lot of Memphians, many of them have a rather close connection to rural areas and to the land. And of course, the time I spent in Ecuador, the people there who were indigenous people and mestizos and persons there lived very close to the land. I can remember seeing women who would be gleaning in a field of a hot hacienda after the potato crop had been collected, and they were picking up small potatoes. And potatoes were one of the staples of life there.
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town in Indiana called Newburgh, and when I was a kid, it was farms just as far as you could see. I remember the one thing that was there was a Hardee's at the intersection, and I still taste that breakfast. It was so awesome. Yeah, so awesome and processed and served in a styrofoam thing, and that was, I think, part of the magic of it. But now I don't, I think back on that, and it's almost shocking to see kind of how far, society has come in that regard. But the idea of getting like a styrofoam thing of food is like shocking now. Every time I go back home, those fields get smaller and smaller, but that's the thing that stands out to me the most and is still so romantic to me. Like, there was almost, something spiritual about that stillness out there. And, you felt so small in this big, big thing. But, so that was the landscape I grew up in, was just this very still space. But as far as the food, I remember, like I said, a lot of fast food. It's kind of, as I got older, it turned more into like a suburban life. So a lot of McDonald's, but certainly a lot of home-cooked meals that were amazing, and I still ask my mom to make when I go home. But something that I didn't personally experience, but was a really big deal for a lot of people, was hunting for their food. So a lot of people ate a lot of venison and venison sausage, and I still remember one time I looked out over our backyard, and there was my neighbor had gone hunting, and I still remember, for whatever reason, the deer was open towards our house, and it was just this moment where I was like, oh my gosh. But I don't know, now that I'm older, I look back on that, I'm like, that's an experience and a connection with food that I think so many of us sort of like, not that we crave that experience per se, but just that intimacy with where your food comes from and what it means to you.
Dr. Davis writes in her book, Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, that the Hebrew Scriptures can be described as an agrarian text, meaning that descendants of Israel, they wrote and thought as people who knew the land intimately, just kind of like what you were talking about, John, and Susanne as well, and understood its role in their survival. I think some of us who live in the cities now, or who buy our food, we don't grow all of our food, can be less connected with the source of the land as essential to our life. And you also mentioned a word, John, stillness and spiritual, and also moments that have been transformative in how you think of land and how you think of the earth. I was wondering if anybody else had a spark moment what sort of changed how you started thinking either about your food or about the land.
I can remember a time, I think that there were a number of experiences that got me to thinking, but a time 15 years ago or more, a beginning period when I would visit my oldest daughter in Austin, Texas, and she and her family. And Austin was very protective of its watershed area. And there were all kind of provisions made to address it. In subdivisions, there were areas as big as 2 lots that were shaped like this to be like a retention basin in rain. There were all kind of requirements about what land could be sold or be developed. I remember the church that she belonged to owned quite a bit of land down one of those tree-studded hills in Austin, but they were not allowed to develop past a certain point because that would have affected the watershed. When you went into a retail store or even a big H-E-B grocery chain to get your groceries, you got no bag, no plastic bag, no paper bag. And it was up to you to deal with that. They checked you out and put those groceries in the basket, and you did whatever you needed to do to get them home. And I've often thought about that here in Memphis and our wealth of plastic bags and all that we have. But I think that another thing that really fascinated me, and I'll maybe say more about it later, was this book, There Is No Planet B, a handbook for the make or break years. And I will say that it was recommended to me by Dave Repke, who is here many years ago. I may say something else about that later.
Well, I have a spark moment every summer, actually. My family attends an old-fashioned camp meeting for 10 days out of probably, it seems to me, the hottest 10 days of the summer. We move out into a campground in Fayette County, live in very primitive cabins. My husband will attest, they are very primitive. And attend worship services 3 times a day in an open-air, sawdust-floored tabernacle. This camp meeting started in the late 1800s, and my family has been attending. And that is certainly not the only place, but the place where I think the connection between my faith and my family and nature are just so very grounded. I can remember as a child when the sermon held absolutely no interest for me and the good music was over, and yet we had to stay sitting on those hard benches. I can remember just twiddling my toes around in the sawdust and sensing that and hearing the bugs and the bullfrogs and the crickets and all of that just beyond the tabernacle, and looking out at the trees and seeing the stars. So every summer I'm taken back to that. And so that is definitely a spark moment for me. Another that I want to share is my first grown-up job after college was working in Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill, and I was there for about 5 years. It was a very, very intense, stressful time, and I had not yet learned work-life balance and taking care of myself. And I ended up coming home gladly, but was diagnosed with clinical depression as a result of, just too much stress, not enough rest, all of that. And the medication that I was prescribed was essential in my healing, and the therapy was essential. And yet what I found, the salvific, and I use that word very intentionally, the salvific experience of being outdoors, connecting to Creator through creation, was a very, very important part of my healing, and continues to be. Like I said, the medication was important, the therapy was important, the rest, but there was certainly at that spark moment, something that I derived, my soul was soothed, literally, by creation. And so I think that's a moment that I go back to frequently.
Yeah, I don't know if I had a spark moment per se. I think like a lot of folks of my generation, conversations around climate change and sustainability, I mean, almost ever since I can remember, those have been, on the news. And so I feel, I guess, fortunate in some ways that I was just sort of immersed in that as a person growing up in America. But I do think that the dialogue around it has, as you get older, you start to see how people can speak to each other or treat each other around those topics. And I think just seeing the clear need for those changes in, not only my life, but just in the way we conduct business and society. I think those have reinforced maybe those foundational principles that, I've been, like I said, maybe immersed in as a younger individual, But yeah, I don't know if that's, like I said, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I know there's a lot of angst too associated with that. Whenever you see that a lot with, especially the people even younger than myself. Like, there's a real, true, existential kind of struggle there. So I think that I feel fortunate, but I also, I think there's a part of life that's been affected by that in a way that maybe it wouldn't have in other situations.
Martha, Lyle, your mentioning of your healing after a stressful period of your life just sparked for me a memory of when I was a young parent living in Honolulu with my daughter Rosie, and all of the houses were very close together, and so if Rosie was crying, at least 3 or 4 sets of neighbors would know it intimately, like the minute she started and the minute she stopped. So I was a little self-conscious about, learning how to be a parent and dealing with a fussy infant sometimes. And something I discovered with my baby was no matter how upset she was, if I stepped outdoors, she would just start looking around like with these big eyes. And I started calling it the magical outdoor cure. So whenever she was upset, I would just walk outside and she would start doing this. And I found that it was effective, even beyond infancy. And it actually works for Dave and me as well as adults. It's like, okay, Dave, I just need to sit on this porch for a minute, and then I can come back and then deal with whatever I need to. So, John, you alluded to a phase of life that environmental talk and sustainability has been part of your life since as long as you can remember. So I wanted to ask, since we represent a variety of ages here, some of us with young children, some of us retired or in the mid-career. Are you thinking about environmental sustainability at this specific season of your life? What is your role? How are you thinking about it at this point?
Well, I mentioned a few minutes ago that I've almost completed my doctorate in land, food, and faith formation. So I've been thinking about this on so many levels at this point in my life. I think as I was kind of anticipating this question, I guess my response is at this point more and more, and this kind of piggybacks on previous comments, I have to be very intentional to not despair or be overwhelmed. I think that when I first became aware of, I worked for Al Gore. That was the gig that I did on Capitol Hill, and that was back in the 80s. So when I first became aware, there was not that sense of urgency. And also I was, young and straight out of college and had all that energy. As I have moved through raising children and am now, our children are young adults, and at this point in my career and at this point in the progression of climate change, I have to be very intentional to make myself aware of and connect to people, to scripture, to resources that are about affecting the change. And that's why I think conversations like this and meeting people who are involved in the work is so important. I think that, I don't know that so much has to do, maybe it does have to do with my exact stage in life, but I know that it has to do with the increasing awareness and this moment of urgency around sustainability and climate change. And I do have great hope. This is part of my decision to be hopeful in the younger generation, my daughters, younger generations, people who have grown up with this knowledge. I do worry about, as you mentioned, that existential crisis, and that's something that we're there are a lot of people doing some really good work around climate grief. So, okay, I'm going to stop talking now.
Well, I guess in some ways I'm really fortunate to have a portion of my life that concern is sort of taken care of for me. Like my job is very aggressively pro-sustainability. Like it's embedded in the work that we do. I feel extremely fortunate for that. But then in my personal life right now, at this juncture, it's hard not to feel hypocritical, because I think the things that I'm able to do, just personally and I think economically, I think is the other huge part of this conversation. It just feels insignificant, right? And that's, I think, leads to some of that despair, or just like, what can I even do? Because I can't, it's not financially feasible for me to put solar panels on my house or replace my HVAC system with geothermal or something. And so I think a lot of smaller actions, like being intentional about composting, being more involved in trying to talk to my neighbors and friends about what we can do around town or in our own lives to sort of move that ball forward. But I think the frustrating thing for me is that I feel like I'm not doing very much at all in my personal life. So.
Well, when I think about this, one thing I think about is why this book was important. I had been in our retirees, our University of Memphis retirees group, and I had urged our book club. I said, we need to read a book about climate change. And they said, all right, you find one, So, as I said, Dave recommended this one, and I found it very, very interesting. The subtitle, There Is No Planet B. Now, that's a thoughtful title. A handbook for the make or break years. And what fascinated me about the book is it's literally all about sustainability. I wouldn't have necessarily described it in that way when I first began to read it a couple of years before the pandemic. And I carefully read it and studied it and was ready to lead a discussion, and the pandemic happened and there was no book club meeting. But the focus of this author is, he talks about how he came to this conclusion out of a scientific background. He realized that people needed to change their values and their behavior if we were going to confront this. And so his whole book, this book is addressed to that. And in the chapters, one question after another, how do you do this one? He also cites tasks that have been accomplished that really created change and were successful. And, but it's a very fascinating book in that way. He doesn't want people to become despairing and give up. And he wants you to work hard at it and so on. And that's a very interesting thing, I think, in that book, this book.
Dr. Davis, in her book, Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture, says that the ecological crisis is primarily a theological and moral crisis. And Susanne, you mentioned that in the book, the focus was on changing values and behaviors. Dr. Davis, I think, would agree with that, and she would also say it's not a technological crisis. It's how we act. So I wanted to ask you, how does your faith, and I think we all have a Christian faith background here, how does that connect specifically with your care for the natural environment?
I think one of the foundational scriptures for me sums it up so well. Genesis 2:15 says, "And then God put man in the garden to tend and keep it." And that was the initial, if it wasn't the first commandment or directive that in the creation story that God gave to humans, it was, I think the first one was be fruitful and multiply. And we have knocked that one out of the park. However, I think that tending and keeping the garden is the essence of what it means to be a faithful Christian. It also, the greatest commandment, when Jesus was asked, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? Jesus put it back at the young lawyer. My dad's a lawyer. Lawyers are always asking those questions and anyway, that Jesus puts it back at him and says, well, you know the law. What is the greatest commandment? Love God, love neighbor as yourself. For me, living sustainably, caring for creation is absolutely a fulfillment of that. We love God by caring for that which God loves and that which God created and called good. Sustainability and creation care is absolutely an issue of justice. The folks who suffer first and suffer most as a result of environmental degradation are those whom Jesus called the least of these. You think back to Katrina. It wasn't the Garden District that flooded. It was the 9th Ward. Right here locally, I'm not going to preach, but the Stop the Pipeline. Caring for creation is a justice issue. That part shows love of neighbor. And love of self. I mentioned the salvific experience that I have in connecting to creation. That is central to my self-care, is connecting to Creator through creation. It has taken me a while to put words and some kind of structure to how my faith is connected to sustainability and my sense of responsibility to call for care for creation. But for me, faithful Christian discipleship is inseparable from caring for God's creation from the very, very beginning. So that's a little bit of my thinking on that.
I want to live out my faith as a follower of Jesus, like you all do, as you know. And as I've reflected about this situation, which has been called the intensive care for the end of life by this author, as I have thought about that, and I think of the words of Jesus, love one another as I have loved you. And it just seems, again, as I reflect on this, that if I'm really going to love my fellow human beings, then I'm going to have to consider how to love the planet. And like perhaps some of you, there's one phrase that has been important to me over the years in the prayer book. And some of you know what probably I'm going to read. It's from Eucharistic Prayer C. God of all power, ruler of the universe, you are worthy of glory and praise. And people respond, glory to you forever and ever. At your command, all things came to be. The vast expanse of interstellar space, galaxies, suns, the planets in their courses, and this fragile earth, our island home. And the people respond, by your will, they were created and have their being. So that phrase, this fragile earth, our island home, has always stuck in my mind and my experience. And it means more to me now than it ever has. And so I just offer that to you as a way to think about this. And I'm sure as we go on, we can talk more about what do we do.
I love that. I love the question, because I think we do often think of ecology and theology as sort of distinct things. But I think, as you're pointing out, there's such a direct connection between how we live and how we treat the planet, how we treat the environment that we live in, and how we treat our neighbors. And I think that for me, as I said, I think I'm probably coming up short living that out. But I think as a as a faith community, or even just as human beings, especially as we as a species, our capacity to do wrong to each other becomes exponentially greater and greater. I think a couple hundred years ago, it's hard to imagine some of the stuff that we've been able to accomplish, against each other and against the planet. But I think that central tenet of our faith of do unto others, I think the examples you're talking about, the pipeline, Katrina, but things like Flint, Corpus Christi, Texas, right? Or some of these things you're hearing more and more about agriculture, where the industrial production of animals is actually having an effect on communities in the rural Carolinas. Do unto others. Like, would you want that to happen to you? And is it something that we should be doing to one another at all? But then I think, of course, as we become increasingly globalized, at this point it's hard to imagine a world where you aren't thinking about smaller countries with less agency. Like, I think that's something we have to be thinking about, not only as people, but as a society. So what is our responsibility to each other, even if we never see each other? Like, I might never meet anybody that lives on a small island nation whose home is disappearing, but I have a responsibility to them because my actions affect them now. This is 2022. So I think that it's it's less of a separate idea. And I think that sometimes people think of, and I know I am certainly guilty of this, ecology and theology are two different things. I can live my life as a good Christian and not have to worry about the trees and the deer. But the trees and the deer are just like, it's almost like a red herring, because like I live next to those things, and my neighbors do too. So it's important to think about those things, but the more of those things are damaged, the more of our neighbors and ourselves are damaged. So I think that's how I think about it.
I want to just follow up on something that Martha Lyle mentioned about the pipeline that was scheduled to go through South Memphis, that Mr. Justin Pearson, who is part of the group that worked to block that pipeline, will actually be one of our speakers at Lenten Preaching Series on April 8th. So if you want to learn more, think more about environmental justice, come back at noon on April 8th for that. And I want to just ask another question based on kind of where we've started to go already, answering the last one, that sometimes theology is thought of as spiritual or heavenly, and sustainability is earthly or bodily. What if we flipped that question? How could our faith be the things of earth and our sustainability be the things of the Spirit? What would you think if we kind of explored changing those associations around a little bit? What could that mean?
I had a good time thinking about that one. I hadn't thought about it a whole lot, but Christianity is an incarnational faith. Jesus is unique among religious figures in that he was the embodiment of God, God with skin on. So I think that it's a little bit of a twist on your question, but I think it is easy for us to think of our faith as being, spiritual and maybe otherworldly, and yet the essence of our faith is that it is a faith with skin on. When we take the Eucharist, the bread and the wine, which are products of the earth, which came from the soil, become the body and blood of Christ. And so our faith really is, in its essence, very much a earthly faith. And I think that maybe that's one of the reasons that this, like you said, the melding of eco-theology rather than ecology and theology really have such salience for me as a Christian, because I tend to be a very, I don't know, I like things with skin on. I mean, I am a spiritual person, but I'm a very tangible person, and I think tend to live my faith that way. I hope maybe as I mature more spiritually, I will become maybe more ethereal or whatever. But right now, it's pretty much, here we are. I'm here. I've been given the gift of life in this place at this time among these people, and I am called to live out that faith right here and right now in the way that Jesus did. Jesus was a very present person. He did go to the garden, he did go to the lake, he did go to the mountaintop. I want to point out that when he needed rest, he went to the wilderness. He didn't go to the temple, he didn't go to a big group of people. But it's an intriguing question, and I'm going to have fun continuing to think about it. So, and I'm eager to hear what my colleagues have to say.
Well, I will go back to this thing that, I mentioned before about the emphasis on changing values and changing behavior. And I think that we can take into account our spiritual lives as well as our practical lives dealing with day-to-day effects. And the other great book I read focuses on that, A Brief History of Earth. It's by a renowned geologist from Harvard, and in 230 pages, he covers 4 billion years in, 4 billion years in 8 chapters, as he said. And it's eloquent, it's beautifully written, and he wrote it to help people value the earth. And his point in the final chapter, Human Earth, is that we are the species, the only species that has had the capacity to transform the planet. And that's what we are doing. But he also points out that we have the capacity to address that. And he says, out of all the different phenomena that have occurred in this human earth period, maybe the most surprising one is how slight the human response has been to that. We've ignored it. We've pushed it back. We've walked on by, you know. And so you get back to this matter of changing values and behavior, I think. And I think that there's a way that Calvary might do that. And I think, and what I want to, as I was reflecting on these good questions that Heidi gave us, you know, I thought about the fact that last Sunday, right here, we had this inspiring program, which I saw on YouTube, about room in the inn. And when I went down to hear Lisa Anderson speak after I was here on Friday, the sanctuary was filled. And it was filled, I believe, in large part by people who had been part of Room in the Inn effort. And that offers shelter for people to spend the night, but it offers a whole lot more. A whole lot more. Affirming these individuals, caring about their situation, and so on. And in that way, Room in the Inn is like 2 other organizations that I know very well. The Hospitality Hub and the Mental Health Court. All 3 of these groups are focusing on serious human problems, homelessness, mental illness, and considering the people who are affected by those problems and how they can be addressed. And the people that are associated with leadership in all of them have been creative and innovative and compassionate. And I wonder if Calvary Church doesn't need to approach this whole problem that we are talking around today in the same way. I wonder if we can't do that. I believe that there's a real possibility that we could begin to find ways. And if you know the history of any one of those groups and all, people sat down and thought and devised, and then year after year changed and adapted and did what they could do to affect the outcome of these people resolving those problems. And I think that's what we have to do about this whole climate change issue. We need to learn about it. And this is, as I say, a really good book, History of the Earth, a narrative, wonderful narrative. And we need to learn about what's going on and then think about where we can get specific. Start with our own community and really deal with concrete issues as we are thinking about ultimate outcomes. And I'm like John, when I hear these dire predictions and all, I feel powerless sometimes. Well, what can I do? Our government needs to do, well, our government does need to do a number of things. But on the other hand, what could I do here in Memphis that would really affect people's lives and the quality of their lives and also address this problem?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine adding much to what these two have already said. I think that's so beautifully put. But I think for me, it's again, like we were talking about, it's just an extension of what our faith already teaches us at the core. And I think to just go out into the world and stop thinking of what we hear in church or what we come to understand through prayer or something as separate from the spirituality we're called to live. I think if we can't bring it out into our communities and into our world, into our lives, then it's hard to see what beyond our own benefit, what the good is. And I think, as you said, like that's maybe one of the core things about Christianity we tend to not talk about, is that it's a lived, physical, it's got skin on it. If you can't do it, then it has merit for sure, but are you really living out the faith? And I think that's the real calling at the end of the day, is to live it, to do it.
I'll say my faith, you may not be surprised to find out, is all mixed up in my compost pile. I've been working on composting for years, and I'm taking a course on it and just learning about the science a bit more. And I bring out the scraps, my banana peels and orange peels, and I add a bunch of brown leaves, and my chickens scratch through it, and eventually, like, it becomes something rich and that I can grow more things with. And it's this resurrection, this death, and this life. It's right there for me. It's a very spiritual concept. It's just right in my backyard. I'll say bulbs do the same thing for me. I plant them in the earth, and I totally forget about them. And I just said to Dave this morning, I don't know what that is, but I must have planted it, and it's beautiful. So I think that the world around us definitely lives the spiritual things that we read and that we teach and that we want to live out. I know we're coming up on time here, but I'm going to pose a question, and I'm going to pose it to the room as well as to the panel. So we have just a couple of minutes, but what do you think would be the role of a group, maybe like this group, maybe like Calvary, maybe as we're approaching a capital campaign, maybe it's a role of your workplace group. What do you think we do, not just as individuals, but as a collective, to incorporate faith and sustainability? And this is an open question. I'm going to give up my mic, and anyone who wants to answer it, we've got just a couple minutes.
I think the church, building on what Susanne said, we need to preach it, we need to teach it, we need to understand that sustainability really is at the heart, and then informed by that and being led by Spirit, live it out in the community on whatever level. That sounds very simplistic, but like you said, that's how every movement, every transformation begins. There are a lot of great organizations in Memphis and certainly in the region and nationally that are focusing on this, whether it's called caring for creation or religious environmentalism. There are resources. The Episcopal Church, as probably most of y'all know, is really a leader in terms of denominations and having materials and opportunities and strong voices in this. what does it look like? I think everything from recycling, which does matter, to solar panels, to rain gardens, to vegetable gardens, but not keeping it just on this particular place, serving this particular group of God's beloved, but really, really engaging and connecting with the larger world and neighborhoods that don't have the resources, maybe the knowledge or the resources to move towards sustainability.
Hi, I'm Christine Todd, and I know most of you all, and I did want to just say everything that you all are saying is so important and so right. We do downstairs. We're very thankful for your clothing that recycles, and it gives things to, as you said, the least of these every Sunday morning. We know that Madeline, Get Mad or Get Green, takes all our boxes. We are so conscientious about that recycling here, and any way that you all think of a way. I think Susanne said, if we're interested right now, what can we do? We can think about a way to start a group of people who have an interest right here, right now, in an environmental focused group that comes up with ways to make God's love visible downtown, which is our mission. So there's so many things that we can do. And water bottles like this, if you have any extra ones in your home, we are very thankful to have a new water spigot, a fountain outside, so our neighbors can come, and dog fountain. So anyway, thank you all.
One other thing that we can do is to come and hear Dr. Davis on Wednesday at noon and at 6:15 for a conversation a little bit like this. First of all, I wanted to thank our panelists this morning for coming in and for being on the hot seats for a little while. So thank you all. And then I'm going to send us out with just half of a Wendell Berry poem, taking a leaf from Scott and Catherine's books. This is a poem that Scott actually brought to our Ellen Davis study last fall, from Manifesto, The Mad Farmer Liberation Front by Wendell Berry. This is just the second half of it. Put your faith in the 2 inches of humus that will build under the trees every 1,000 years. Listen to carrion, put your ear close and hear the faint chattering of the songs that are to come. Expect the end of the world. Laugh. Laughter is immeasurable. Be joyful, though you have considered all the facts. So long as women do not go cheap for power, please women more than men. Ask yourself, will this satisfy a woman satisfied to bear a child? Will this disturb the sleep of a woman near to giving birth? Go with your love to the fields. Lie down in the shade. Rest your head in her lap. Swear allegiance to what is nighest in your thoughts. As soon as the generals and the politicos can predict the motions of your mind, lose it. Leave it as a sign to mark the false trail, the way you didn't go. Be like the fox who makes more tracks than necessary, some in the wrong direction. Practice resurrection.